Welcome everybody to this week's episode of a Junior VC Behind the Scenes. I'm joined with Nilesh and Shreyans as we talk about our piece this week, Will India Stack Enable a Global Fintech Superpower? As for why we chose to write about this piece, UPI is something that we've wanted to talk about for a while, and recently Nepal actually became the first country outside India to adopt UPI. So UPI was going global, and we've seen so much happening in the fintech space around this, so many fintech companies coming up, leveraging this new technology. So we thought it was a great time to take a step back and talk about the Indian fintech stack. So Nilesh, can you tell us how this all started? I believe it was back in 1991 when we had liberalization, and can you tell us how that kind of kickstarted this whole process in India?
Right. So the story of change in India almost always starts from 1991. So after 1991, at the end of the license Raj, we all know how the country's economy grew fast. Uh, our politicians and our countrymen realized that to grow fast, we needed to build infrastructure. Obviously, in 1991, the first step was that we don't even have physical infrastructure such as roads and highways, which was then tackled with road infra projects, the highlight of which was the Golden Quadrilateral. However, once the physical rails were ready, then at the same point, the next problem came up. The world was becoming digital. Where is India's digital infrastructure? And the problem started with with an understanding that to bring the rest of the country to the same level of freedom and wealth as the upper 10% or 1%, we need to bring in, at least we need to start to bring in bank accounts to all Indians. So financial inclusion was the first motivating factor for for our planners, and there were many steps which were taken for this. We ramped up our bank branches, we did priority sector lending, we tripled our ATMs, we launched Manrega, so on and so forth. But in most of these cases, people realized that the key reason why it was difficult to open a bank account was Indians were not able to prove their identity in a cost-effective manner with high integrity. In 2009, only 1 in 5 Indians had a bank account. At that point of time, the government launched a digital identity card for Indians, which we now know as Aadhaar. Now, Aadhaar was supposed, at the planning stage, Aadhaar had ideas of having biometrics, and which was laughed about, that in a country where you can't even feed people, how can you think of having a biometric card for every Indian? But then we know what happened to all of this. The UIDAI was born, and the game changed totally. At the same point of time, a private think tank called iSpirit got into the act and attracted talented volunteers to help India build India's digital infrastructure. In 2015, they first, after every bank account had every Indian had an Aadhaar, they came up with an open API policy in 2015 for India. And there started the story of India Stack. So India Stack was envisioned as a 3-stage problem, where the first stage was to give every Indian an identity. The second stage was to allow digital transactions on costless, cheapless digital transaction on top of that. And the final stage is what we are calling as a data empowerment layer, where user consent is taken to share their data. Now, Aadhaar, eKYC, and eSign were the first 3 building blocks of India Stack. Right? And then we had UPI, which was the second block. And now, at the end, today we are seeing the start of account aggregator as the third.
So now let's zoom in a bit more into that UPI block and what kind of happened in 2016. Digital India was a narrative that was kind of coming up, and UPI was officially launched, I believe, in 2016 for public use. What happened then?
Right. So on one hand, Indians were very lucky because our bank account, our bank transaction systems, even in 2000 to 2006, were the most advanced in the world. And even at that point of time, let us say in 2006 to 2008, we already had multiple modes of transfer between banks. We had the NEFT, or the National Electronic Funds Transfer, which transferred at that point of time once in every 5 hours. Slowly, today it transfers once in every 2 hours. Half an hour. We had the real-time gross settlement implemented by the RBI and other banks, which transferred large volumes of money instantly. Later on, another payment system called as the immediate payment system, IMPS, was launched, which did the same thing for small value transactions.
Okay.
Now, what UPI did was, UPI ultimately runs on IMPS as the core underlying transfer mechanism, the protocol. But UPI added wrappers around it. And specifically, it allowed wrappers in which 5 parties come together to do one transaction, UPI transaction. They are namely your UPI app, your bank account, the NPCI server, the customers, the friend to whom you are sending the money, their Google Pay, and their bank account. And the money flow, the information about the money flow is shared among all of them. Now, what this allows is, it allowed fintechs and startups to deliver superior UI, UX, and customer experiences to a large number of Indians without worrying about integrating with the bank. Secondly, it also, the banking regulator was also safe and secure, knowing that the permission and the authorization is given for only one single transaction and not for other banking functions bundled together, like you see in internet banking. Once this happened, innovation was always almost in the cards. Startups came, startups saw, they realized that India is a huge market. There is a problem which needs to solve. And we saw an explosion in UPI apps, whether it is Paytm, whether it is PhonePe, whether it is Google Pay, or several others, which we can now have lost track of. That's how it started. This digital rails, this concept of providing the digital infrastructure as a public good and letting startups innovate on the front end, has what has actually kick-started, and I must say, gone, put a rocket ship to India's fintech dreams.
And with this infrastructure layer built, I think there was also fuel added to the fire with Geo introducing dirt cheap data, and at the same time, the launch of the data empowerment and protection architecture in 2017. Those kind of macro factors, they must have helped to really accelerate this adoption.
Exactly. So in between, certain other accidents kept on happening. We had demonetization, which gave a flip to to digital payments. We had Geo, which made data cheap for everyone. And as if these two were not enough, last year, a couple of years ago, we had the pandemic, where earlier handling cash was an inconvenience. For the first few months after the pandemic, handling cash was a health hazard. It is no surprise that digital transactions skyrocketed after the pandemic. Because if you go and see at that point of time, here was a simple mesh system to transfer money from your account to the merchant account instant.
Definitely. And so as you'd expect, the volume skyrocketed. Can you tell us a bit more about what this looked like in terms of the numbers and where India Stack ranked in the rest of the world?
Yeah, so if you see the numbers behind this, the UPI transactions have skyrocketed from roughly 707 million, uh, sorry, roughly around 70,000 crores, just over 70,000 crores in December 18, to what is today around 8,26,000 crores in December 2021. If this is not exponential, then I don't know what is. And it's now that we look back on it, it seems like a miracle. But the fun part is we all witnessed this happen right in front of our very eyes, which is what makes it so unbelievable and so unrealistic, and yet we feel very proud about it.
Yeah, no, it definitely is quite an incredible story, and we're just starting to see the results of all of that infrastructure.
Exactly.
Years of
Exactly. So I must say that it is not just accidents like the demonetization of pandemic which are there. The government also got it big time into this once they figured out that the system is working. The Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, which started which had a focus on what we call as JAM, Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile, meant that all subsidies could be transferred to the direct to the bank accounts of the beneficiaries. For this, the India Stack continuously innovated and came up with two additional payment systems called as the Aadhaar enabled payment system and the Aadhaar payment bridge. What it meant that if you enter an Aadhaar account, Aadhaar number, money could be transferred directly to your bank account linked with Aadhaar from the central government, bypassing all the intermediaries in the middle. For an Aadhaar enabled payment system, AEPS, a banking correspondent or a bank mitra, as it's commonly known, could go around villages, take a fingerprint authentication on a bike, and become a micro ATM, traveling micro ATM all across.
Yeah. It really.
Now,
No, please.
yeah, go ahead. So after that, after all this data is generated, the India Stacks application changes, user application changes, the viewpoint changes. The point is simple. We are a data rich country, but we are not an economically rich country. And in the future, and we know how data is gold. So India Stack thought about, can we do something about the user's data that is getting generated in all these transactions? Can we do something about it? Can we enable consent-based sharing very easily so that the user can benefit from the data that they have generated?
That's where we
This
get.
was the
And this is what we
yeah.
described as the third layer of that India Stack. Yeah.
Exactly. This is the third layer of India Stack, and this is what is getting enabled in what you earlier mentioned as the Data Empowerment and Protection Act. What this act on this associated, and by the way, account aggregator is the first example of what is called as a consent artifact in the India Stack system.
And it's probably a perfect time to transition over to Shreyans, who can talk a little bit more about that account aggregator framework and the impact that it had on building out that third layer and really accelerating growth with India Stack.
Sure. So the coolest part about innovation in a way is when you're hit badly, that's when the greatest innovations actually take place, right? So Nilesh had explained the fact that we had a demonetization. Then we probably went through a cycle of the pandemic, so on and so forth. These were actually the areas where, and not to forget the fact that whole geo kind of came in right in 2016 or so, and 2017 took off. Part of the reason was telecom industry which is so not profitable industry in any country, and India for sure, yes, not a profitable business at all. You seem to realize that there had to be one player who could probably kind of give this at complete leverage, and I'm sure government had entrusted on one of their close aides as such. But the fact that India was not in a great position because none of them actually used as much as data. Data was super expensive back then, and also the fact that we were going through a lot of pain in terms of tech that is to be used. So slowly we realized that innovation was the only way possible, and we were already messed up. The only way possible was on going from top here. Now, when this was taking place, innovation like UPI overtook almost any sort of innovation across the globe. Right, people started transacting a lot, and they started transacting to XYZ players or their friends, family, so on and so forth. They didn't know the fact that data at that point of time was actually a commodity, but rather at that point of time, they realized data is probably as useless as anything would possibly be. So the
important about the transactions at that point, right?
Yes, exactly. So the fact that transactions was the most important thing for the regulators, for the government, as well as for the people who actually used it. So no one actually gave importance to the fact that data was any sort of an important parameter of sort, right? Right then, globally. A lot of folks realized that data leaks were happening. A lot of scams in terms of how the user data is being used were taking place. So the whole act puts together the fact that a user requires to give some sort of a consent for sharing his or her own data, right? Which is what account aggregator comes as a very beautiful framework and acts like a traffic police in a sense. And I say that because of the fact that it basically has folks who would be a data service providers, and that would be a traffic police in between, and would be close to a data user who requires the data at that point of time, right? And by the way, these can be interchangeable, right? The fact that the folks who can provide the data can also be at some point of time the folks who need the data, right? Likewise, banks can be, as well as fintechs can be the same interchangeably, which is why account aggregator as a business is still an RBI government business, governed business, and also it is regulated in terms of what business functions that each of the account aggregators can get into. So now an account aggregator with that rich data cannot obviously get into a fintech business very clearly, right? They would forever be in a business where they're heavily regulated, and they'd probably be a traffic police through the life cycle under the governance of the RBI as well as the regulators, right? So this is very important to keep it as a clean, transparent structure, and also the fact that someone who can just help us move the data with the user's consent in the eyes of the regulator almost at all points of time makes to believe that there would be lesser of data leaks, makes to believe that there would be a lesser show of data scams that takes place in future, and makes us to believe that the transition of data from one application to another, from one bank to another, and from one user to another is very seamless, and they don't need to do some sorts of SMS scrapping, web scrapping, etc., to find the data of a particular user.
And when you look at it, right, I mean, this was such a big innovation that it wasn't, and it's a problem that every country faces, but India had uniquely solved this problem, right? What was the global approach and reaction to this?
Sure. I personally have used payment in 4 different continents, in 4 different countries, right? I've seen how payment workflow takes place for different applications, and to my own eyes, I've seen certain payment applications have certainly been governed by, say, a big tech like an Apple Pay, to a certain pure government-based something like a DBS, right, in Singapore. So when you realize that certain payment applications are actually owned by companies, and likewise, say, WeChat in China, right? You'll realize when these are single companies and entities owning the payment kind of applications. India had to innovate that, which is where India's infrastructure prowess came in, right? When you build an infrastructure that is completely different from an application, infrastructure builds on open rails and provides the infrastructure, the rails, to anyone to come and build on it. Now, this suggests that the world is stunned, right? Because of the fact that before I used to build my own infrastructure and have an application on that, but now I have an infrastructure that is ready, and which is obviously in control of the governments. And there are players across the globe, be it as small as a player from, say, Tamil Nadu, to as big as a player from, say, Silicon Valley, comes and builds on the same infrastructure, and both of them have their own share of the market, right? That is very powerful, right? That is powerful because a big player cannot come and just kick you off and say that I'm too big because I have I'm a $2 trillion company and I can't take you off, which is a company of just started of sorts. So the global reaction was crazy, right from the fact that big tech CEOs realize that India is taking control in their own hands, to the fact that governments kind of applauding such a system where governments across the globe, where India kind of gets doesn't be a complete undemocratic sort of a player, a nation where our neighbors are, but also the fact that we also give opportunities to everyone to thrive and survive, right? Likes from Bill Gates, Sundar Pichai, Satya Nadella from Microsoft, to the governments of Singapore, Nepal, UAE, Bhutan. Everyone enjoys of the simplicity and the transparency that has been out there. Now, my good friend would probably say it's not decentralized, and I call it as a transition to decentralization, right? So essentially, giving every player to thrive and survive is what this problem statement had given us, right? And no Indian government would probably come and tamper it, surely because of the fact that it has been such a successful outcome, not just for us, the people, but also the players in the market.
What better recognition on a global level than Nepal actually adopting it, adopting UPI? I mean, it's clear, but I mean, you bring up a good point. Where do we go from here? I mean, India has been so innovative. The government of India has drafted a national strategy on blockchain. Where do you see this headed in the future?
Sure. So even before we go there, obviously there are a lot of flaws that, and a lot of folks might realize and should realize that building such a big infrastructure at a large scale does bring in a lot of pain to the people, right? While we have built the infrastructure, we've just built it, but we're not kind of tried to maintain it for the users who would like to kind of change on a recurrence basis. What do I mean by this, right? So I personally, when I came back to India, I realized the fact that changing a number on my Aadhaar took me nearly a week or so, right? So and there was no tech portal for it. So this is a flaw that kind of we need to kind of amp upon, the ability where we can also take in and reduce the number of failure rates. I understand that obviously Google Pay over a period of time had a lot of failure rates when they started, but there's a lot of cost that is involved in it. So this is I think we probably need to look at as we go ahead. The ability where government should probably build on the momentum, although usually governments are pretty slow in amping up after one success. I think momentum is everything in this game. Once a country realizes that it is super powerful, I don't see why don't we have UPI credit at full scale. I don't see why we don't have OSIN at full scale. I don't see why account aggregator, although released long time back, why don't we have it at full scale? I don't see why just 4 banks, not all the banks come into the picture, and just 4 are there in today's time. There's a lot of things that the government can probably take control in its own hands and push banks, financial institutions to kind of adopt almost all of it, which has been said in their draft papers back in 2016, 2020, also the fact that the recently released papers. Now, speaking about what's next, right? And you mentioned a few things about blockchain, very fancy, but a lot of things actually come before the blockchain part of it, right? The fact that we talk about an Indian health stack, a national health stack system, I think that's probably more important to the fact that a country that has always been deprived of healthcare, quality healthcare, right? The fact that we would have private, public hospitals, practitioners all on one stack, where people realize that there would be a price transparency, discovery of hospitals, discovery of good clinics, and discovery of good healthcare professionals, and then the price discovery as well of each of them, because the differences probably are a lot more. So technically, while the urban enjoys good healthcare, the rural still is stuck with the healthcare systems. I think the national healthcare changes the game for building such an infrastructure in the healthcare ecosystem. While we do that, there's another thing that India will probably explode, is of course the commerce, right? Commerce is what India enjoys. Our biggest startup till date was in e-commerce, Flipkart, and the fact that commerce even till date only 9% to 10% of it is actually only tapped for these SMEs and MSMEs. No, that's a very small number compared to what India could potentially do, right? So what I understand with the whole, the open network for digital commerce is the fact that this would enable higher exports. Firstly, the fact that it will make it a lot more transparent and no big player in e-commerce can enjoy their price parity, can enjoy the fact that give additional discounts to the consumers, and they can probably get all of them on board. What this would do is that this would decentralize the whole commerce chain in India. This would enable us to potentially get more SMEs and MSMEs on board for commerce, selling it internally as well, and also the whole transparency of price, delivery, so on and so forth would be essential. And while we do this internally in India, gives us so much more pleasure that this would also happen externally, right? In a sense that what I mean by externally, the exports would increase drastically, and that is the most important parameter for our GDP to grow in the coming years, right? And last and foremost, where we see the whole the blockchain ecosystem, while I think still in its nascency stage, I do realize that the fact that we would make it a more transparent ecosystem for not just finance, health, commerce, but almost in any of these data-driven backings and the stories that we have today in India. Now, I hope all of this comes through.
Thanks so much, Shreyans, for giving us a very broad view of where the India stack can go and the solid foundation that's been laid and what all we can build on top of this. It certainly sounds like there's a lot of opportunity, certainly areas where we can improve, but a lot for us to look forward to as the India stack evolves. Thank you everyone for tuning in to this week's episode of Junior VC Behind the Scenes, and we'll see you again next week.